The resume on top of the pile had a typo in the email address, and that was the only reason Margaret Hale almost threw it away. She caught herself, corrected the figure in her head, and kept reading. Daniel Voss, 46 years old, applying for a position in the mailroom. She had been sorting through applicants for the better part of an hour, and most of them had blurred into a single shape. Competent, unremarkable, exactly what the job required, and nothing more. The pile was the usual mix: retirees looking for something light, college dropouts looking for something steady, a few applicants who had clearly applied to every opening in the building without reading what any of them actually were. Margaret had learned a long time ago not to expect surprises in a stack like this, but the name stopped her, not because she recognized it, but because nothing about the application matched. Under education, he had written a master's degree in structural engineering from a program that didn't accept walk-ins, the kind of school that turned away 3 applicants for everyone it admitted. Under previous employment, there was a 6-year gap, followed by 2 years stacking shelves at a hardware store and a brief stint loading trucks at a regional distribution center. Under references, he had left the field blank. She read the application twice, then a third time, the way you re-rate a number that doesn't add up, hoping the second pass will reveal an error in your own arithmetic instead of the documents. She didn't call him in through the front desk the way she normally did. She walked down to the lobby herself. He was sitting near the window in one of the stiff plastic chairs the lobby kept for visitors, hands folded in his lap, not checking his phone, not glancing at the clock above the elevator bank. He had the particular stillness of someone who had made peace with waiting a long time ago, the kind of patience that isn't cultivated so much as worn into a person by years of practice. "Mr. Voss?" He stood unhurried. "That's me. Margaret Hale. Come on up." She brought him into her own office instead of the small interview room HR usually used for entry-level positions. She didn't examine why. She set his folder on the desk between them and sat across from him, studying his face the way you study handwriting you're not sure you've seen before, looking for the version of the person the page described, somewhere underneath the version sitting in front of her. "Your application says structural engineering," she said. "We're hiring for mail sorting." "I know. That's a significant gap between the two." "It is." He didn't elaborate, and she let the silence sit for a moment before deciding not to push. Instead, she asked the question that actually mattered to her. Why this job? He considered it the way a man considers something he's already decided but wants to say correctly the first time, without needing to revise it. "I want something with edges," he said, "a start and an end to it. A cart that's full, then a cart that's empty. I've had enough of work that never finishes, where the goalposts move every time you get close to them." There was no self-pity in it. That was what struck her most. He said it the way you'd describe the weather, a fact about the world rather than a grievance against it. She told him there was an opening in facilities planning, entry-level on paper but closer to his actual training, paying nearly double what the mailroom offered. She told him she could move his file without anyone needing to know where it had started. He shook his head, polite but immovable, the kind of refusal that didn't require raising his voice to be final. "I appreciate that," he said. "I mean it, but I'd like the mailroom job, if it's still open. I'm not ready for something like that yet." She sat with that for a moment longer than she needed to. She had run operations for a company with 3,000 employees for the better part of a decade. She had made calls that cost the business real money and calls that saved it twice as much. She was not, by nature or by training, an easy woman to surprise. But something in the quiet certainty of his voice reached past the part of her that managed people for a living and landed somewhere else. Somewhere she didn't examine too closely while he was still sitting across from her. She told him the position was still available. She told HR to start the paperwork before lunch. He started the following Tuesday. He came in early, before the building unlocked its side doors for the morning shift, and the night security guard mentioned it the way you'd mention something unremarkable, that the new guy was always already there, moving boxes with a kind of quiet efficiency that made the whole floor feel less chaotic than it had in years. He didn't talk much. He nodded when people passed him, the kind of nod that didn't require anything back. By the end of his second week, he had reorganized the package intake system without being asked, restructured the sorting bins by delivery route instead of alphabetical order, and cut the average wait time for inter-office mail almost in half. Nobody had requested any of it. It simply happened, the way improvements happen when someone notices what's broken and corrects it without making an announcement about it. The floor supervisor, a heavyset man named Carl Reyes, who had been with the company 19 years and treated that number like a title rather than a tenure, noticed the changes too, though not with the same appreciation everyone else seemed to share. Reyes had built his entire professional identity around being the person who knew how things worked, and a new hire, an hourly employee 3 pay grades below him, making the floor run better without consulting him first, registered less as a contribution and more as an insult. He started small. A cart parked an inch too far from the wall. A label turned the wrong direction. A delivery flagged as late that wasn't actually late, corrected loudly enough for 2 interns near the printer to hear every word. Daniel took it without visible reaction. No slump in the shoulders, no tightening in the jaw. Nodded, fixed whatever had supposedly gone wrong, and moved on. The way water moves around a stone, not because the stone has won anything, but because moving around it costs less than arguing with it. Margaret witnessed one of these exchanges from the stairwell landing on her way down to check on a vendor delivery. Reyes was midway through explaining, with exaggerated patience, that a professional would have caught a scheduling error before being told about it. 2 interns near the monitors were doing their best impression of being absorbed in their screens. Daniel listened, said he'd take care of it, and wheeled his cart toward the elevator without a trace of tension anywhere in his posture. Margaret said nothing that day. She filed it away instead, in the part of her mind that kept track of things requiring attention eventually, even if not immediately. The mailroom settled into its rhythm over the following weeks, and Daniel became, in his quiet way, a fixture of the building. The receptionist on the ground floor, a woman named Donna who had worked the front desk long enough to know every employee's coffee order without asking, started leaving a cup near his cart every morning without comment. He drank it, left the empty cup where she'd find it, and nothing further was ever said about the arrangement. It simply existed, the way certain small kindnesses exist in office buildings without anyone formally deciding to start them. Margaret found herself watching him sometimes, not with the scrutiny of someone evaluating performance, but with the specific attention you give something you're trying to understand. He was never performing contentment. She had seen people perform it, had done it herself in investor meetings, projecting a steadiness she didn't always feel underneath. Daniel's calm wasn't a performance. It was simply what he had become, whatever this particular stretch of his life amounted to. She hadn't asked him again about the gap in his resume. She had decided to let him bring it to her if he ever chose to, though the question hadn't left her. It sat in the back of her thinking the way an unresolved piece of music sits in the back of your hearing, present and waiting. One evening, leaving later than usual, she found him in the lobby restocking the directory near the elevators, the building largely emptied out around him. He worked without music, without his phone visible, without anything to suggest the silence bothered him in the slightest. "You're still here," she said. He looked up. "Few more cards to finish." She stood near the door longer than she strictly needed to for someone with somewhere to be. "Are you all right?" she asked, not entirely sure herself whether she meant tonight specifically, or something larger, the whole unaccounted stretch of years that sat behind him like a distance she could see the shape of but not measure. "Yeah," he said. "I'm all right." He said it without qualification, which was either the most honest thing she'd heard in months or the most carefully managed. She couldn't quite decide which, and she said goodnight and walked to her car without deciding. It was around this time that a second figure entered the periphery of the story. A junior facilities coordinator named Theo Park, 26 years old, recently promoted into a role that put him nominally above Daniel in the org chart, but functionally beneath him in every way that mattered. Theo had been hired the year before out of a logistics program, full of the specific confidence young employees carry when they've never yet been wrong about anything important. He treated Daniel the way Reyes did at first, with a low-grade, unexamined dismissiveness, until the day he watched Daniel solve, almost as an aside, a scheduling conflict that had been bouncing between 3 departments for 2 weeks. Theo had brought a printed spreadsheet down to the mailroom looking for an empty table to spread it out on, muttering to himself about delivery windows that didn't line up with the loading dock's shift changes. Daniel, sorting packages a few feet away, glanced at the sheet without being asked, and said, mostly to himself, that the problem wasn't the windows. It was that the dock's shift change had been scheduled around a labor contract from 3 years ago that had since been renegotiated, and nobody had updated the dependent schedules downstream. Theo stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I don't," Daniel said. "I just noticed the numbers don't match the assumption they're built on." Theo checked it. It was correct. He didn't immediately understand what had happened, but he understood enough to stop dismissing the man pushing the mail cart, and over the following weeks he started finding small reasons to talk to Daniel. A clarifying question here, an offhand problem there, until what had started as condescension quietly reorganized itself into something closer to respect, and eventually something closer to friendship. It was Theo, more than anyone besides Margaret, who would later insist that what happened to Daniel mattered, and who would say so loudly enough that other people had to listen. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, the way these things tend to, quietly, then everywhere at once. The structural assessment team had been retained for the company's new downtown tower, a 40-story project already 6 months behind schedule and bleeding money daily and carrying costs nobody wanted to say out loud in budget meetings. At 9 in the morning, the lead engineer, a precise and usually unshakable woman named Priya Anand, discovered a load calculation error buried somewhere in the foundation modeling. An error that, if uncorrected, meant the building's lower supports had been specified with a margin that failed to account for soil shift on the eastern lot, a detail that wouldn't matter for years and would matter catastrophically the one time it did. By 11, the conference room on the 12th floor was full of engineers with laptops open and faces arranged in the specific stillness that means a problem is bigger than anyone is willing to say aloud yet. The whiteboard at the far end was a mess of notation. Load distributions, soil composition figures, 3 colors of marker tracing 3 different failed approaches, each one abandoned a little further along than the last. Priya's team had been at it since 7. They knew the building was unsafe as currently specified. They didn't know exactly where the original number had gone wrong, only that it had, somewhere in a chain of calculations dense enough that nobody could isolate the single point of failure without redoing the whole sequence from scratch, a process that would take longer than the schedule, or the client, or the carrying costs could absorb. Daniel came in at 11:20, not because he was invited, but because his afternoon mail run passed the conference room, and the door had been propped open with a chair to allow foot traffic to the adjacent server closet. He stopped in the doorway to move the chair back into place so he could close the door behind him and finish his round. He didn't move the chair. He looked at the board for almost a full minute. Nobody noticed him at first. The room was too absorbed in its own pressure, engineers typing, Priya on the phone with the client's structural consultant, 2 analysts arguing quietly over a printed soil report near the windows. Margaret, standing near the back wall reviewing something on her tablet, caught him in her peripheral vision and looked up. He wasn't reading the board the way a stranger reads something unfamiliar. He was reading it the way you check a number you already suspect is wrong, with the narrowed, specific attention of someone confirming a suspicion rather than forming a new one. He found Margaret's eyes without searching for them. There was a question in his expression, not spoken, just the particular look of a man who has seen something and is trying to decide whether saying so is his place to decide. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage without anyone else at the table noticing. He crossed to the whiteboard, picked up a marker from the tray, found a clear section near the bottom corner, and wrote. He didn't write slowly, and he didn't write with the performance of someone demonstrating intelligence for an audience. He wrote the way you write when the answer is already formed and your hand is simply catching up to your mind. 6 lines, clean and tight, ending in a circled term that isolated exactly where the soil coefficient table had been misapplied. Priya was still on the phone. A junior engineer near the window, a young man who hadn't yet learned to disguise his reactions, said out loud without thinking, "Who wrote that?" The room turned. Priya ended her call mid-sentence. Someone laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound, because the man standing next to the whiteboard was wearing a gray polo with the building's logo stitched on the chest, and there was a mail cart parked just outside the door. "I could be wrong," Daniel said, setting the marker down without any ceremony. "But your soil coefficient on the eastern lot is using the wrong table. That's where your margin disappeared." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has happened that nobody has a script ready for. Priya walked to the board. She stood in front of his 6 lines for a long time, ran something through her own laptop, and her expression moved through several stages. Skepticism, focus, recognition, and finally the very specific look of a person watching someone open a locked door without using a key. "Check it," she said to the room, not looking away from the board. They checked it. 40 minutes later, the corrected soil coefficients had been confirmed against the Regional Geological Survey. The revised load specifications were already moving through to the structural fabrication team and the tower's lower supports, which would have failed eventually, silently, exactly when the soil shifted enough to matter, would now hold. Nobody said anything to Daniel directly. He retrieved the chair he'd been about to move, finished clearing the hallway outside, and continued his afternoon route. By the time the room had reorganized itself around the relief of the crisis being over, he was 2 floors down, sorting inter-office envelopes as though the previous 40 minutes hadn't happened at all. Margaret found him near the loading dock that afternoon, his cart against the wall, going through the day's final batch of outgoing mail. "Where did that come from?" she asked. He didn't look up right away. "I worked load calculations for 9 years before I stopped," he said. "You don't lose the part of your mind that does that. It just goes quiet for a while. Mine never really stopped. It just didn't have anywhere useful to point itself most days." "What happened after the engineering job? I need to understand it." He was quiet for a few seconds, organizing rather than avoiding, the way he organized most things before he said them. His wife had gotten sick, he told her. 3 years of treatment that worked for a while and then didn't, most of it more expensive than their insurance could absorb without consequence. He'd taken leave, then more leave, then come back to find his position had been folded into a restructuring while he was sitting in waiting rooms learning more about oncology than any engineer should ever need to know. By the time she passed, he was in his early 40s with a 2-year gap in his resume that no hiring manager in his field wanted to look at directly, and a level of exhaustion that made the idea of starting over somewhere new feel less like an opportunity and more like a sentence. He tried, for a while, to find his way back toward something closer to his training. The gap came up every time, or his age came up, or the market had shifted in some small, specific way that closed the entry point he was reaching for. After enough years of that particular kind of rejection, a person stops spending energy on doors that don't open and starts focusing instead on whatever door is actually available. "I don't tell people this for sympathy," he said. "I made the choices I made because they were the right ones at the time. I'd make them again, knowing what I know now." "You could have called someone for help. You could have called me. I wasn't going to put my problems on someone else's desk." "That wasn't your decision to make alone," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite a concession, but close to one. "Maybe not," he said. "Word travels in office buildings the way it always does. Sideways, through people who heard it from people who were in the room, until enough of the right people knew the shape of what had happened without needing to be told directly." By the next morning, most of the building understood that a mailroom worker had walked into a stalled crisis meeting and solved in 6 lines a problem a team of licensed engineers had spent half a day failing to find. Theo Park told the story twice before lunch, both times with a kind of proud insistence, as though Daniel's competence reflected well on his own judgment for having noticed it first. Donna at the front desk heard it and simply nodded, unsurprised. The way you nod at confirmation of something you'd already privately decided was true. Reyes heard about it before 5 o'clock, and he came to Margaret's office at 4:45 with his arms crossed, already certain of what he intended to say before he said it. An hourly, custodial-adjacent employee, he explained, had entered a restricted technical meeting and engaged directly with proprietary structural data, without authorization from anyone in the management chain. He used the word liability twice. He used the word precedent once, with particular weight, as though the word itself were doing the arguing for him. Margaret let him finish without interrupting. When he was done, she asked him one question: whether the building's load specifications had been corrected. Reyes said that was beside the point. She said it was, in fact, exactly the point, and that she would look into the matter herself. She said it in the tone that ends a conversation, and he left. She knew what he was actually reacting to, and it had little to do with protocol. It was the fact that a man who delivered mail had solved something a room full of credentialed professionals hadn't, and that particular kind of disruption threatened certain people more than any structural failure ever could. 2 days later, 2 members of the board reached out to her directly, having been briefed, by someone she suspected with a specific framing in mind, on what they called the conference room incident. They used careful language, the kind that keeps a polite distance from what it actually means, expressing concern about an unauthorized employee accessing proprietary engineering data and what that might suggest about the company's internal controls. The message underneath was clear enough regardless of the careful wording. The situation needed resolving, and resolving in a way that protected the company's formal structures rather than the person who'd kept those structures from failing. Margaret drafted a response twice. The first version said too much of what she actually felt. The second was measured, professional, focused on outcomes rather than indignation. She sent it knowing it likely wouldn't be enough. She was right. She was still at her desk past 8 that evening when her assistant forwarded an email from HR. Daniel Voss had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. No grievance listed, no complaint, just a single line thanking the company for the opportunity and wishing it well. She read it twice. Then she walked down to the mailroom where his cart sat against the wall, his thermos and a small spiral notebook tucked neatly into the side pocket, as though he'd packed up with the same unhurried care he brought to everything else. He was already gone. She drove to the address listed on his emergency contact form without calling ahead. It was a modest 3-story building on the east side of the city. His name written in pencil on a buzzer panel half full of names and half blank, the kind of building that had been declining for years without quite finishing the process. He let her up after a long pause, without asking who it was first. His apartment was small and ordered, a single room serving as both living space and kitchen, a table by the window covered in graph paper filled with numbers in a tight, even hand. He turned the page face down when she sat across from him, an automatic gesture as though he didn't want unfinished work to become part of the conversation. "I know how it ended," he said before she could begin. "I handled the board," she said. "I told them a man with no current credentials solved in 40 minutes what a licensed structural team had spent a full day failing to find, and that any company responding to that by pushing him out of the building wasn't managing its own assets intelligently. 2 of them pushed back. I told them I'd be glad to reconvene the discussion once they'd found someone else who could do what you did. That ended the conversation. And Reyes, no longer with the company. That decision was mine to make, and it should have happened a long time before it did." He was quiet, looking out the window at the flat gray light coming through it. "I'm not looking for a redemption story," he said finally without irony, as a genuine statement of where he stood rather than a rejection of what she was offering. "I'm not interested in being someone's proof that talent always finds its way back, no matter how long it takes or what it costs along the way. That's not what I'm offering you," she said. "I'm offering you a position reviewing structural risk on active projects. No corner office, no title that puts a target on your back. just the work, done by someone who can actually do it and paid like it matters, because it does. He looked at the notebook on the table for a long moment. The way you look at something you've carried so long you've stopped seeing it clearly. "What about Theo?" he asked. "And Donna? People who were decent to me when there wasn't any reason to be. Theo's been telling anyone who'll listen what happened, loudly enough that I didn't have to do much convincing on his end. Donna doesn't need convincing of anything. She already knew." Something close to a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, the first real one she'd seen from him. "All right," he said. "Not dramatic, just decided, the way he decided most things, with the fewest necessary words and without performing the weight of the decision." He started on a Thursday. Margaret had already addressed the full floor that Monday morning, 400 people arranged across chairs and along the walls, laying out plainly what had happened. The algorithm of the structural error, her own team's failure to find it, and the institutional reflex that had nearly cost the company the person responsible for catching it. She didn't name Reyes. She didn't need to. The people who needed to understand exactly who she meant understood without difficulty. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then someone began clapping, and the sound moved through the space the way sound moves when it actually means something, gathering rather than fading. Daniel's new office was a converted storage room on the 9th floor, cleared out over the weekend, with a whiteboard mounted on the far wall and a window looking out over the street below. He set his notebook on the desk, uncapped a marker, and stood in front of the blank board for a moment, the way you look at something waiting to become useful. He wrote a single equation at the top, not a solution, just a starting point, and stepped back to look at it. Theo knocked on the open door a few minutes later, holding a printed report he clearly intended to ask about, and Daniel waved him in without looking away from the board. Outside, in the storage closet of his old apartment across the city, the mail cart's gloves still sat in a drawer, not because he needed reminding of what he'd lost, but of the distance he'd crossed to get from there to here, and of every quiet, unhurried step it had taken to make the crossing worth something. Finally, to someone other than himself. If you liked this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so that more heartfelt stories like this reach you first. Thank you.